As many of you know, I am Melissa Cross and I am the Education Manager for CAMI. Thank you all for joining our interview session today featuring Marcus Whitney. So to kind of start today, just some quick insight on CAMI's interest in interviewing Marcus today. Student interest in getting involved in private equity is increasing. From data collected on graduates from CAMI accredited programs, the number of students being placed in private equity was reported by our program as up 100%. However, this means that 2 students were placed into private equity venture capital firms in 2018, 2019, and only 1 in the prior year. But from this slide, we see that the opportunities in private equity have greatly increased. As we can see in the chart, the market is moving toward more IPOs and greater influence of private equity. It is projected to almost be more than 2.5 times as much it was in 2016. What does this mean for students graduating from CAMI accredited programs? Today's guest, Marcus Whitney, runs a large private equity firm and will discuss that impact and importance. So without further ado, we are pleased to have our own president today and CEO of CAMI, Anthony Stanowski, interviewing special guest Marcus Whitney. A brief intro, which doesn't even highlight all of Marcus's accomplishments, contributions, and current projects. Marcus is a self-taught software developer, entrepreneur, and venture capitalist with a track record of success in all areas. Marcus is the founding partner of Jumpstart Health Investors, the most active venture capital firm in America focused on innovative healthcare companies with a portfolio of over 100 companies. He recently launched Jumpstart Nova, the first Black healthcare venture fund in America. By investing exclusively in Black-led healthcare businesses, Marcus is empowering Black entrepreneurs to create opportunities, address disparities, and work toward achieving equity in healthcare. And lastly, Marcus is the author of the Amazon #1 best-selling book, which we'll touch upon later, Create and Orchestrate, about claiming your creative power through entrepreneurship. Be sure to check it out. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Anthony to start the interview session for us today.
Melissa, thank you very much. That was quite an introduction, Marcus, to some of your background and what you've done. I think the fascinating part when you read through your book is you realize that it was a hard journey getting to where you are today. So can you tell us a little bit about what motivated to get to where you are today, and a little bit about the difficulties along in that journey?
Yeah. So first, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be speaking with you today, Anthony. In terms of motivation, I think it is pretty clear to me in hindsight. My motivation was being a parent, being a father. I sort of start the book 20 years ago when I arrived in Nashville, college dropout, waiting table 6.5 days a week. And the very first thing I needed to do was create a much more stable source of income for my family. And so before becoming an entrepreneur, I had to get sort of the foundational skill set that I would then use to parlay into entrepreneurship. And that was learning how to code. And it was a bit of a loophole because the internet was outpacing academia, which is somewhat relevant to our conversation today. The internet was outpacing education around the internet. And that meant that companies that needed programmers couldn't require a degree because the degree didn't necessarily mean they were going to be trained in the latest web technologies. And so I was able to use that loophole to study on my own, build websites, on my own, independently build a portfolio, and get my first job as a junior developer at a company called HealthStream here in Nashville. Mm-hmm. And so then, parlay that into the rest of my career. But without a doubt, if I didn't have my back against the wall as a dad of 1 kid and then another on the way, I'm not sure I would have worked 6.5 days a week and then nights and weekends and in between shifts studied as hard as I did to sort of make that leap. So yeah, and in terms of like why was it so hard, I think that entrepreneurship is a career. All careers have difficulty. I think entrepreneurship is a full contact sport, and you are exposed to all aspects of business. Whereas often if you're an employee, you sort of like focus in on one particular area of business. And I talk about the different areas of business in my book, leadership, finance, operations, marketing, sales, product, service. So, most people, if they're taking a career path and they're an employee, they'll usually like find their way on one of those particular concepts and get really, really strong, and then be part of a larger organization where other people are handling those areas. if you're an entrepreneur, you, especially starting companies, you have to understand all of those concepts. And in the beginning, you have to do all of those things. And so that's, the degree of difficulty just naturally increases because what you're trying to do is just fundamentally broader and more difficult. And then if you were not classically trained, which I was not, then you learn in the school of hard knocks, which I did. And so difficulties arise when you're playing with real money, real employees, real companies. It's not playing, but that's what it is when you're on the process of learning. So, failure is somewhat inevitable, but that's how you really do learn in this walk of life.
Now it's interesting you mentioned motivation being your child, and I remember when we had our first child, or my daughter, my mom said to me, "Children bring good luck," and I went, "Well, what do you mean by that?" She goes, "You have to work hard once you get children." And it's the truth. It's the prime motivator that starts out there. Now, you mentioned in your book, Create and Orchestrate. And let me just kind of repeat that title for everyone: Create and Orchestrate: The Path to Claiming Your Creative Power from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. And in the beginning of the book, you talked about how you had your book all ready to go, and COVID-19 hit, and you said I had to go and I had to change my preface and kind of alter a little bit within the book to kind of account for that. I think it's been an interesting twist with COVID, where innovation, entrepreneurship, things are changing, and they're not going back to 2019. They're going forward in a whole different approach. Talk to me a little bit about how you really kind of see innovation as kicking up a notch at this point.
Yeah. So we're a little past the year of me having to reflect on that as the world shut down, and my book published date was June 30th of last year. And I don't know. I mean, I time stamped the note that I added in the beginning of the book, sort of acknowledging the fact that we didn't know what the world was going to look like. But it's, I think if we all try to put ourselves back to that point a year ago, I mean, we had never seen the kind of unemployment. The bankruptcies had already started by this point, right? And so the idea that I was, entrepreneurship and my book, it's the topics are, they're kind of like uplifting topics. They're exciting, kind of hero's journey kind of thing. At that moment, what I was most worried about was that it was just going to be completely inappropriate and come off as very, very tone deaf for me to be talking about entrepreneurship when it was clear we were in the middle of a societal state of emergency, right? Um, and I ultimately made the decision that as I started to see us all reverting to video calls and e-commerce and Amazon and delivery, Instacarts and all these other kinds of things, I was like, yeah, if we didn't have entrepreneurship, we would be in way worse shape now than than we would have been otherwise. And I also could really clearly see that things were not going back. It was very clear to me things were not going to go back. This was going to be a long-standing thing. And so basically came to the belief that my book and others like it were going to be necessary because a whole lot of people were going to have to reimagine how they were going to engage with the world, and they were going to have to do so through the lens of entrepreneurship. That some industries would not return, right? And we would be experiencing this sort of unasked for creative destruction that would happen because as the world was quote unquote shutting down, we had also reached this point where the internet was at scale and ready for the moment. If you think about it, 10 years ago, we would have been in way worse shape, right? Because the internet was not ready for this moment 10 years ago. But it was ready in 2020. It was ready with the streaming services. It was ready with Amazon. It was ready with the delivery services. It was ready. Right? It was ready with Zoom. And so uh, that to me was the signal that wow, a lot of wealth is going to transition. A lot of industries are going to be accelerated in their demise, and people are going to have to understand some of these fundamental building blocks of entrepreneurship. And so it actually increased the importance of me getting the book out.
Yeah.
When I came to that belief.
I mean, it's funny. I have a very good friend who's heading up the American Telemedicine Association, and her comment was when she joined it, I joined the Sleepy Association that was seeing some growth, but it was really hard to where it was going. And then all of a sudden, COVID kicked in, and we became, the number one most important organization in the world, and a lot of money was kind of flowing into that area. And I think you've seen that. I think the interesting part around this is it's really kind of taught us what to do when the next crisis kind of comes on, and how do we need to adapt to that, some of the skills and competencies that we need. What have you seen has been, and I know you've talked to a lot of different people, and you've seen, looked at several different companies. What do you see as kind of the core competencies that make some people, some organizations maybe a little more successful during this time?
Well, look, I mean, the basics are they digitally literate, right? Were they able to engage cloud-based technologies and streaming and social networks and all of these e-commerce? Were they able to just sort of seamlessly shift into those things, or was there an entire upskilling process necessary for that? And I think for those that were able to seamlessly just adjust into these tools, it was kind of it ranged from being not that big of a problem to, in some cases, like hyper growth, right? Hyper growth, because they were able to sort of take advantage of this loss of economic activity from the brick and mortar world. So I think that's fundamental, and it's actually something that really worries me. You know, as someone who uh, it has been self-taught. The foundation for all the success that I've been able to achieve was that I started with learning technology, specifically web technology. And so I'm 45, so I'm not a digital native, right? When I grew up, there was a rotary phone in my house, and sort of things of that nature, right? But um, because when I really got serious about my career, I started with web technology. And back in 2000, when you were starting with web technology, it wasn't abstracted the way that it is today. And let me just sort of explain what I mean by that.
Yeah.
Today, we have tons of uh, companies that are like service layers on top of the internet that are actually what people interact with and interface with. So the obvious ones would be like Google, Facebook, Amazon, but then there are other ones like Stripe, right? That just got valued in the private market at like $96 billion. And most people who aren't engaged in online businesses don't know just how much money flows through this company every day, because you never see them. They're kind of like Intel Inside, but they're a service layer on the internet, right? And so when I was learning the internet back then, Stripe didn't exist. Like, all these things didn't exist. So I had to actually learn the internet,
Yeah.
the actual like HTTP and TCP/IP, and the email protocols and all of these like fundamental things. And so when I'm looking at the world today, like I mean, I can explain to you how Zoom is working. You know what I mean? Like, I understand it. And what worries me is that we have, you know, at this point, not just one generation, but multiple generations, I would say millennials and Z, that are not really like, they know how to consume it and they know how to interact with it. They have the old digital native thing going on, but they don't necessarily know how to drive it outside of like taking videos and putting them on TikTok and things like that. And that's concerning, right? Because the real value creation is not on contributing free content to these networks where you then are actually the product and you're being monetized through ad networks. It's by actually creating value on the internet,
Yeah.
adding to the layer of value creation. And so that worries me, right? That worries me. That that is going to be, that it's just going to continue to be such a fundamental part of how the economy works, and that we aren't teaching it in high school, and then we really don't teach it in college, honestly. So, and we're talking about coding, and I don't think it's coding. I think it's internet literacy. I think it's like actually understanding how the whole thing works.
Yeah, yeah. It almost, it reminds me a little bit of 100 years ago or 70 years ago when automobiles kind of kicked in.
Mm,
Had people who really understood how the cars worked. And I
yeah.
think of my father, who really was a mechanic and could get in and, you know, fix a car when it broke down on the side of the road compared to where I am today, which is, hey, I pull into the auto mechanic and he fixes things and I don't worry about it. And in fact, the auto mechanics have to be so much more sophisticated than where they were.
That's right.
And I think, we're at that point in the internet age that you're just kind of describing as well too. Um, you have the venture capital fund. So there's a one venture capital fund that you have, and then you've kind of spun off or spun out another one, Jumpstart Nova, the first Black-led healthcare venture fund in America. Talk to me a little bit about that project, what your goals were, what you really wanted to try to accomplish with creating that.
Yeah, so important. It's not. I don't know that it's the first Black-led healthcare venture fund in America. But what we're referring to it as the first Black healthcare venture fund, and the reason for that is it is majority Black owned. The general partnership that's running the fund is majority Black owned. But probably more important is that 100% of the investments that we're making are in companies that have Black founders in them. That's actually kind of the really important thing, is the criteria for capital allocation is specific. So, what was the question? Because I wanted to make sure I just sort of clarified that.
Well, I think it gets around that, which was intentional investing. I mean, you
Yeah,
really kind of, and tell us, a little bit about, why you went ahead and kind of started this fund.
yeah. So over the last 20 years, I've sort of worked from technologist to startup leader to entrepreneur to investor. I've been working my way to this side of the table over the last 20 years, and what I've realized is how much leverage exists in capital allocation, right? And and I then started to understand how venture capital brands and private equity brands are unknown to the general public, right? So the general public knows Facebook, the general public knows Google, the general public knows Amazon, the general public knows Apple. The general public does not know Venrock. The general public does not know Sequoia. The general public does not know Bain Capital. The general public does not know these capital brands. But all the brands I said that the general public knows would not exist if it were not for the capital allocators. Okay. And so you're not only talking about these companies that have become these multinational utilities at this point, right? You're talking about them being created from an unseen force uh, of leverage that is actually completely unnatural to the way that an economy would work if they didn't exist. Which is to say, these companies are invested in with hundreds of millions of dollars that allow them to lose money for very long periods of time while they build market power
Mm.
in such in such a way that when they do turn the revenue generation on, it's like they go from making no money to hundreds of millions of dollars overnight. But it's because people have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in the run up. And it's not even a new thing. Like if you look at the role that JP Morgan played in electricity and steel and AT&T back in the day, that this role of the financier who would bet on the entrepreneur and back them for a very, very long time because it would take construction or science development or something like that to sort of truly make a market shifting business possible, right? Um, that's what capital allocation is. And then furthermore, there's the people who allocate their capital, and I'm going to get there in a second, but they're the people who allocate their capital to these funds, right? Which are these big pension funds or these big endowments, okay? That also people don't understand, like look at the size of Harvard's endowment, look at the size of Yale's endowment, these are multi-billion dollar endowments. And so that's how the flow goes. It's like they are funding the funds then fund these companies then create these multi-billion dollar approaching trillion dollar companies. So now and they have taken over like wealth. They've taken over wealth. They've taken over value. If you look at all the billionaires, it's gone from like, Gates to Zuckerberg to Bezos to now Musk, right? These are four white men. And so now you have to look at who's allocating the capital and who's getting the capital allocated to. And that's where you get to the real serious issue, right? which is it is just so overweighted towards white men allocating capital to white men that you have this unseen, misunderstood, unnatural force in the economy that is significantly disadvantageous to everybody who's not a white male. Okay, and we're and the really tricky thing about it is when you then add media to it, you know, your Fast Companies, your Inc. magazines, your entrepreneur magazines, you start to kind of create these hero-like ethos around these people who are successful. It creates this feeling of superiority, like these people are superior in their capabilities. And the reality is the point of leverage that is actually creating this massive disparity is capital allocation. So yes, and so just to like drive it home, in venture capital, it's been well stated, you know, Harvard Business Review, et cetera, have said it, like 1% of venture capital prior to 2020, 2021, because I do think it's changing pretty radically right now, because of, you know, the murder of George Floyd and the movement over the last, you know, 9 months. But prior to that, 1% of venture capital was going to Black people, and you know, then if you split it by gender, like the percent that was going to Black women is just like it's probably zero. I mean, basically statistically zero. Um, but of course, you know, Black people in America make up, you know, 13, 14% of the population. And so you're talking about a gap in allocation of 12%, right? I mean, this is significant. And so if we agree that talent does not over index based on any gender or racial specificity, then you're over investing in one demographic and significantly under investing in another one. So you've got this societal issue in terms of there's significant discrepancies in wealth allocation that are fundamentally wrong. But then you've also got this, you're supposed to be seeking alpha as an investor, and you're over investing in a particular demographic, so you're likely getting into a lower quality band of talent because you're digging too deep there, whereas you should be more evenly spread across the demographic spectrum.
Oh, gotcha. So it's basically finding the opportunity that's out there in the market, given that no one else has really kind of tapped into it in that specific way.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And by doing so, you also happen to be doing the right thing for the country. Like you also happen to be like helping to balance things,
Yeah.
you know, in the country.
Yeah, that's true. Now, I was intrigued by one of the relationships you had with an entrepreneur and a philanthropist, John Ingram, who you met with the Nashville Soccer Club that you're involved with. He really seemed to have an influence on you. So, um, particularly around what you were talking about with the societal purpose with the allocation of funds. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from Mr. Ingram, how you've kind of brought that forward, and you know, what are some of the next steps that you've kind of moved on to from there?
Yeah, so you know, John's family, the Ingram family, is a very philanthropic family, and they're very, very much committed to the city of Nashville. So, you know, if you stay here any amount of time, you will quickly find that there are a group of families, the Frist family, the Ingram family, the Turner family, and others, but those are sort of like the three big names that you will find have made investments all over the city in education and arts. You know, now John making one in sports, but it's really kind of a community asset investment, quite frankly, bringing a Major League Soccer team to town. Nonprofits around entrepreneurship, you know, investments in equity. So you know, what I would say is that there's a legacy in his family of investing in the community, right? Um, and so probably if I learned anything from John, it was that the way that people in Nashville uh, behave when they are uh, lucky enough to be successful is that they invest back into the community, right? Um, and so you know, I got to see that years before I ever met him. You know, just through the works. I actually didn't meet John in Nashville Soccer Club. I met him in service. I met him when I was on the board of the Nashville Entrepreneur Center, and he was the chair of the Nashville Entrepreneur Center. And he was also an investor early on in Jumpstart funds. So we met in business and in service,
Okay.
which I think made something as significant as a pro sports deal possible. We had already had, sort of a relationship. But John is also, and I want to say John, I really should say Ingram Industries is an investor. They're a limited partner in my new fund.
Yeah.
When I shared what I was doing with him, I mean, he was immediately, like, I'm in, but I think that my organization wants to be in. We had one meeting, and Ingram was, I think, the first. Ingram was the first institutional investor, I mean, the first corporate limited partner to join Jumpstart Nova as an investor, which is always huge. When you get that first investor, that gives you the credibility to then go on to the next institutional investor. And at this point, we just closed on 4 of them, today actually. So I think John, John is a friend, and he is he's a great guy. I hope that he is also learning from me, because we have different backgrounds, and we I think we have a lot to share with each other. Um, but really just seeing how somebody with that kind of uh, financial strength, carries themselves it's a great role model. He's not a flashy guy. He's very kind of ordinary. If you saw him in a grocery store,
Yeah.
do you think he's anyone, just anybody, and not knowing he's chairman of the largest privately held company in the city, right? And he's just a nice guy, very approachable. I could pick up the phone, call him anytime. Just
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
guy.
Okay, good. I've got a few more questions for you, but I just want to remind everyone that's on the phone call today, if you do have any questions, type them into the chat session, and we'll get to them during the part. But Marcus, let me kind of go back. There was something that your friend Clint Smith wrote in your book, and let me kind of read the quote for you directly. It was, Marcus was always somehow bigger than whatever thing Marcus happened to be doing at that time. And when I read that quote, what I thought about was the higher calling, that you're doing something that's kind of serving a larger purpose than what you're actually doing at the time. And you talked about how that's kind of related to you, but I want to kind of just talk about that a little bit related to, in fact, some of the people who are on this call are doing it too, in healthcare. And it's funny when you talk to students about why are you going into healthcare, very rarely does anyone say, well, to make money. I think they're
Right.
doing it because of a higher calling. Um, what would you say to any student kind of listening to this broadcast, or to this podcast, this web session, about that higher calling and how important that is?
Look, I was very lucky because I wasn't called to healthcare. I stumbled into it, and thank God that I did, because it's what I'm quite happy to do for at least the foreseeable future, and I can't see that being any less than the next 20 years. Because in healthcare, you got to be willing to put in several decades to make an impact. I think that's just sort of the nature of this world that we're in. Um, Healthcare is so I one of the philosophies that I personally adhere to is the Japanese philosophy of ikigai, uh, of the intersection of what you're really good at, what you love to do, what the world needs, and what you will get paid for, what the world will pay you for. And sort of at the center of those things, the Japanese have called that ikigai. um, I love that. And I think that if you're fortunate enough to have uh, something in healthcare, which the beauty of healthcare is it's so broad that almost certainly, like, it doesn't have to be clinical. You know what I mean? There are things you could do to contribute to it, and something that if you can get the thing that you love and the thing that you're good at nailed, healthcare has needs and will pay you for it, right? Like, that's the really cool thing. So you can healthcare is one of those uh, great industries where you can do good and get paid for it because there's such a huge economic infrastructure in place. You know, I think that there are. So let's take another industry where I think the world needs it, and you can be passionate about it, but we haven't quite gotten the you can get paid for it thing in place yet. And I really hope we figure it out quickly, which would be climate, right? The world needs it, uh, but we haven't like worked the economy part out yet. You know, it's still ridiculously sort of a fringe thing. Um, and healthcare is not. Healthcare is the largest slice of the United States GDP, right? And so there's huge opportunity, and I think part of what we're talking about is the opportunity in private equity, right? Where investments in healthcare, because healthcare has to change for a confluence of reasons, um, will require capital allocation, and that's a particular path. Will require ingenuity and entrepreneurship. Will require new therapies. So there's research, there's science in place. Will require people to take healthcare out of the dark ages of marketing and make it a more consumer friendly business model. There's just no matter what your skill sets are, they almost certainly can be applied to healthcare, which is awesome.
Yeah. And we see that happening. I mean, Melissa threw up that chart at the beginning where it showed, 40% of our students are going into hospitals and healthcare, and then more are going into other areas. Unfortunately, a very small number are going into private equity right now. Maybe perhaps they don't understand enough about it to really kind of want to understand how do you kind of move into service in that area. But if we were to look at that pie chart 20 years ago, instead of 40% going into hospitals, it would probably be something like 90, 95%.
Sure.
We've seen, pretty dramatic changes over a relatively short period of time as different industries have kind of come up. When you think about, again, the students that are out there and trying to understand what to do. I mean, you talked about being an entrepreneur and the need to understand the very lowest level of the business. When I began at Cami, I had to learn what domain name settings were. I had not a clue about what that but I had to alter them one day. What would you say, to the student? This is what you need to think about. Here's where you really need to kind of focus your competencies on.
Well, I think you need to really understand how the healthcare industry works, and I don't think almost anyone does a great job of really articulating that, quite frankly. You know, and that's something I'm actually working quite a bit on right now. Is helping to frame up, sort of in a similar way to what I did in the book, around like how do I simplify the jargon and the framework of what actually a business is. I'm trying to work on that for healthcare too, because it took me a long time to like wade through all the nomenclature and the acronym soup and all these other kinds of things. But at the heart of it, um, there's how care is delivered and how care is paid for.
Yeah.
And
It's
then there's
crazy.
right there's how care is delivered and there's how it's paid for, and then useful in both of those is data, right? And that's it. That's literally healthcare. Then you got the patient and you got the regulators. That's the whole thing. So if you can kind of understand that that's the fundamental scaffolding of the whole thing, and then figure out where do you want to play, uh, that's a good start. A lot of people are going very, very deep into a very specific thing, but the problem is, because healthcare is in a period of change. Okay, it absolutely is. It's in a period of change. If you don't understand how the larger thing works, you may find yourself spending a bunch of time and energy investing into something that is going to be gone in 5 years. And I wouldn't want anyone to do that, right? So I'd want you to be able to look at the way that things are today, understand they're changing every day. Healthcare does not and should not change overnight, but it is changing faster than it has in the last 25 years right now, right? And you need to sort of understand that. You need to understand why that's happening, what's driving that happening, and try to skate where the puck is going. Try to say, okay, is the thing that I'm doing going to be resilient, going to be anti-fragile as this healthcare industry changes over the next 5, 10, 15 years?
One of my favorite quotes from Wayne Gretzky, by the way.
Totally. It's gonna live forever, because it's so good.
So I think that's a great comment to kind of add too, because I think what our programs do is they educate students on what healthcare is all about. And it's that large body of knowledge that we kind of bring to a student, not focused on a specific area, but understanding overall, here's what you need to think about with healthcare from the financing perspective, from the marketing perspective, from the patient experience, and your relationships with physicians, technicians, and the like. I think those are all kind of really, really good concepts that our programs get through. So good answer. Let me kind of, again, throw it out. Anyone on the call who has any questions, if you want to raise your hand or put them into the chat room, please go ahead. And again, another quote from your friend Clint Smith from the book. You had the it factor when it came through, and
Clint is very kind. He's a good friend. I'm not sure I deserve those words, but
Well, my first comment when I read from what your friend said about you was like, wow, you've got really good friends, because I know what my friends would say. But when you look at students, or when you look at young people, how can you see that it factor in them?
Curiosity and excitement, right? And a willingness to learn, a willingness to work hard, a willingness to do what's asked of them, sort of early in your career. I mean, ambition is a wonderful trait, but it has to be properly paired with competency, or it leads to some bad outcomes, generally speaking. And so, yeah, I think curiosity and excitement are kind of the two things you look for, kind of the gleam, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the working hard part is core too.
And the working hard.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation, Marcus. I've got to tell you, I really enjoyed myself with it, and got to learn a little bit about you and what you're trying to accomplish. It's been great for you kind of being on this, and I really just want to thank you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored that you would open up the platform and allow us to have this conversation. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Melissa, I'll turn it back to you for the closing comments.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you again to Marcus today I know you're super busy, for giving us the time and having this conversation with Anthony, and being so informative about being an entrepreneur, and how to encourage being innovative, especially with a lot of our programs listening. And hopefully they picked up a couple tips today on how to incorporate that within their curriculums, or just have conversations with their students. So if you wanted to learn more about Marcus, you can check out his website, his Jumpstart Health Investors Fund. His book is available on Amazon, Create Orchestrate, that they had mentioned a couple of times. And he also has a great podcast called the Creative Power Podcast. So again, just wanted to thank everybody for attending today, and a special thanks to Marcus and Anthony. And I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.